Mike Juster is a poet, translator, and literary critic. He's published quite a lot in poetry, the Paris Review, the New Criterion, the Hopkins Review, and many others. But most importantly for us today, and for us at Paideia in particular, he's a very accomplished translator of Latin poetry. He's published a translation of Horace's Satires, Tibullus' Elegies, and the Elegies of Maximianus, among other things. But today we're focusing on one of his most recent publications, which is an English translation, a verse translation of John Milton's The Book of Elegies, which appeared with the Paideia Institute Press that is with us in 2019. This book is really unique. I'll only say a few words about it before leaving the floor to Mike. It really revealed to the public a new Milton, as the LARB reviewer said, a witty Milton, a youthful Milton who can even be insecure and lovesick at times. So certainly a very different poet, a very different Milton from the one we're used to based on reading his English poetry, and of course, particularly Paradise Lost. So without further ado, over to you, Mike, for a talk on John Milton's The Book of Elegies.
Thank you very much. Well, and thank you for hosting this today. I'm very grateful. I do want to start with one strict rule for the questions. I've got just a few feet away a 45-pound Springer Spaniel puppy. And so no words that are spelled C-O-O-K-I-E or W-A-L-K, because it will disrupt the conversation. I thought I'd start with the classic line from the Talking Heads, which was, "How did I get here?" As Marco mentioned, I translated, my first two classical translations were Horace's Satires with UPenn Press and Tibullus's Elegies with Oxford University Press. And when I finished those, I was feeling like there wasn't anything obvious that I should do next. Nothing that was in many of the classical texts had been done many times. But in doing the notes for those books, I had come across a lot of texts that I had never heard of or heard of just a little bit that seemed pretty interesting. So I started keeping a running list. And when I finished with Tibullus, I started looking at a lot of late antique and early medieval texts, and that led to the publication of translations and commentaries for St. Aldhelm's Riddles and for Maximianus's Elegies. The Maximianus and the Aldhelm were fun. They got good reviews, but I didn't get the sense that they were making their way into the classroom, which was part of the goal. So when I was looking at the next project, I was looking for something that might have a little broader appeal, and came across the idea of taking this section of John Milton's first book, really, the Poemata of 1645. And he'd broken out a section of it to call Elegiarum Liber, which I've translated as the Book of Elegies. It had been sort of an afterthought in translation in larger collections of the Latin poetry or the poetry generally. It had gotten sort of a workman-like prose versions. There's a kind of erratic David Slavitt version as well. And I think that I had the sense people were missing a lot. And so by trying to do it the way I envisioned, I thought perhaps I could contribute in some way. Milton started writing these poems at the age of 16 when he started at Cambridge University as a freshman, which was less unusual at the time to start that early. But I don't consider these poems juvenilia. Milton had set out at a stunningly early age to be one of our great poets. And he was hedging his bets as a teenager, whether that meant English poet or Latin poet, because it wasn't at that time obvious, if you wanted to be considered a great poet, whether you'd be writing in the vernacular or writing in Latin. While they're not juvenilia, I also don't think of them as, they're sometimes characterized as the greatest poems of the Anglo-Latin tradition. And I don't believe in that either, even taking a little criticism for saying that. But I think, as usual, the truth is complicated and somewhere in between, but it's still, I think, a fascinating text that really deserved its own independent consideration. Just a few weeks ago on Christmas Eve, in the LA Review of Books, I published a review of the new Nicholas Mcdowell biography of Milton. And one of the many reasons that I like this book is that it didn't try to put one label on the mature Milton and then use that label to go back and reinterpret everything that went before. Instead, I think it presents a complicated, evolving poet. And I think that's the proper way to look at Milton and understand Milton. So in talking about the text itself, there would be a certain logic to starting with Elegy 1 and moving to Elegy 2 and so forth. But I think that actually doesn't work as well as skipping around a little bit. So if that's confusing, I'll try to make it as unconfusing as possible, but I'm going to skip around the book. Oh, by the way, I was actually very pleased to do this with the Institute for several reasons. One is, unlike a university press, I could talk them into doing an inexpensive version so that real human beings could actually buy the book. And I also decided to donate my royalties to the Institute. So if you buy this, make sure that you buy it directly from the Institute, because Amazon will skim off all the profits and stuff. So remember to buy it directly from the Institute if you do buy it. Okay, so page 71. So the structure of the book is that there are 7 elegies, and they're followed essentially by 2 sets of epigrams, which I'll get to in a little while. But the epigrams start with an untitled epigram, which is sort of a general apology for the generally youthful work in the Book of Elegies. I think some of the epigrams may be a little bit later, but these are primarily poems that were written while he was an undergraduate. And at the time that he's pulling the Pomata together, he's probably 36. Now, most of us have some embarrassment in middle age about our teenage poetry. But I think that this sort of half vague apology may be a little bit more complicated. So I'll read it, it's short. From a perverse persistence and contrariness, I once made pointless trophies to my vileness. Of course, poor judgment drove me while misled this way, and my flawed teacher was my untaught youth. Until a shaded school supplied Socratic streams, and I unlearned the yoke I had accepted. With fires doused continuously from then on, my heart has stiffened, packed in by thick ice. So even Cupid with his arrows fears the cold, and Venus dreads the strength of Diomedes. So he starts with a general apology, and you can see from his use of the word niquidiae, which I've translated as vileness, that he's making some pretty harsh judgments about his own work. It's definitely a kind of defensive preemptive strike. He doesn't say which poems make him squirm for which reasons. It's basically a reckless youth is a first line defense to whatever criticism his critics might have. And you have to remember that the literary business in the 17th century could often be deadly. But if there's a poem that would make Milton squirm just on its aesthetic merits, it is probably Elegy 2, which is the shortest of the elegies and the one closest to juvenilia. Like all the epigrams and the 7 longer poems of the Book of Elegies, the meter in Elegy 2 is taken from Ovidian elegies, although the meter became sufficiently popular in late antiquity, it became a workhorse that it lost its association with the amorous pursuit of a woman, which is something that it would have had in the Augustan era. Elegy 2 is an elegy in the more modern sense of a poem of mourning, but Milton's elegy isn't very convincing in its mourning for a university administrator. I had a joke planned there, but I thought maybe somebody in the audience might take it personally. It also turns in part on wordplay about one of the dead man's titles. He was the university crier, in addition to other things. In other words, the one who would come out and summon people to a meeting. But it isn't particularly amusing or insightful. Milton was a sophomore when he wrote it, so I suppose we shouldn't be surprised by some sophomoric humor and some sophomoric showing off of his classical knowledge. But I'll read a bit from it so that you can, actually I can read the whole thing because it's short. Second elegy on the death of the crier of Cambridge University at age 17. You, famous for your gleaming mace, who used to rouse Athena's flock so often with your voice, cruel death, the crier's final crier, takes you to and shows no bias towards his own vocation. Although your temples may have been more white than plumes, beneath which we accept Jove hid himself, oh, you deserve to grow young with Thessalian potions, deserve the chance to live to Aeson's age. Deserved care by Asclepius to call you back from Stygian currents as the goddess urges. I sort of blew that flow there, sorry about that. If ordered to assume troops in uniform and flee your Phoebus as a speedy herald, you stood just like winged Hermes in Troy's court, dispatched from the celestial citadel of Jove, like your bodies bringing Agamemnon's harsh commands to furious Achilles' face. Elegies 5 and 7 are improvements over Elegy 2. They're longer, they're more ambitious, but they suffer from the same main problem of Elegy 2. Elegy 5 is a pastoral poem, and Elegy 7 is about love. And my short take on both poems is that this bookish teenager had no real experience in either area, so the poetry is highly derivative despite being technically impressive. Then it gets more interesting. Elegies 1 and 6 are epistolary poems to the great love of John Milton's life, Charles Diodati. Now, I'm not suggesting a homosexual relationship or even an attraction, although many scholars have in recent years. I just think he was a lonely young man who had one strong friendship that started in grammar school, and that he never formed such a bond again with other men or his 3 wives. In these 2 elegies, you see a warm, even wryly funny Milton. The formal pose adopted in almost all his other work is dropped, and you see him, I think, fairly clearly as he was at the time. This Milton surprises even scholars. He tells Diodati about his many trips to the theater, but most scholarly opinion until fairly recently discounted this observation and assumed that they were secondhand based on the older Milton's contempt for theater. Only with the discovery that Milton's father was a part owner of London's Blackfriars Theatre, famous theater, plus the discovery of Milton's heavily annotated first folio of Shakespeare, did most scholars accept the truth was more complicated than they had believed. Milton clearly had extensive firsthand knowledge of the theater, just as he told us in this elegy. The language of these elegies should also rock some comfortable assumptions about Milton. Too often we see Milton as inevitably destined to be an epic poet, but there's in fact really nothing in the Book of Elegies that would reinforce that view. Not only did he use Ovid's elegiac couplets instead of Virgil's dactylic hexameter, he compares the 2 great poets and comes down perhaps jokingly, but still on the side of Ovid as the greater of the two. While pursuit of poetic greatness in Latin poetry necessitated an eventual epic, and of course Milton knew that, the young Milton clearly reveled in the language and imagination of Ovid's mythology and romance to a greater extent than the battle scenes from the Aeneid. Milton also repeatedly looks to Ovid by adopting and adapting imagery from Tristia and presenting himself as an exile. And this alienation comes in part Milton left, let me see if I can, hold on a second. Oh. Here we go. Milton left Cambridge his freshman year, and the circumstances of that are highly debated, whether that was voluntary, whether he was suspended for a time. There's an issue about whether his tutor, who he was living with along with several other students, actually physically beat him. And everybody has an opinion, and there's really no evidence to know for sure what happened one way or another. But he does talk about it in this way in Elegy 1. Now, I don't care to see the reed choked cam again, nor does the home denied of late disturb me. In barren fields devoid of gentle shade, Its barren fields devoid of gentle shade aren't pleasing. That place so poorly suits Apollo lovers. To bear a callous master's threats and other things repugnant to my nature is not fun. If this is exile, to have gone to hearth and home and seek out welcome leisure free of worries, I did not shun the label nor protest my lot, and gladly celebrate my exiled state. The humor in Elegy 6 is even a little bit better than that of Elegy 1. He starts with a jab at Diodati. My gut not full, I send you healthy greetings, which maybe you will need with yours distended. And then he goes on to kid Diodati about his Christmas revelries. How well you sketch dull food and cheery Christmas time, and feasts that praise a heaven-fleeing God, and luxuries and winter joys of country winter, and French wine drained near charming fireplaces. Why wine that verse is alien to wine in banquets? A poem loves Bacchus, Bacchus loves a poem. Phoebus was not ashamed to wear greenberry clusters and to choose ivy over his own laurel. So it's when you parse that, what's interesting to me about it is that it veers toward sacrilege, because on the list of things that are dull and uninteresting are feasts that praise a heaven-fleeing God. Now, I think this hasn't gotten much attention. It's sort of made much more generic in the translation, some of the translations I've seen. And I think part of this goes to how our preconceptions about a text control our reading of it. And I went to a fascinating talk once by Penn of Penn and Teller, who co-produced two marvelous Shakespeare plays, which I saw both of them. One was Macbeth, and the other one was The Tempest. And he got asked at this talk I saw him give about casting Lady Macbeth as a blonde. Now, there was a little hint that there was an ulterior motive, because it was April of 2016, and the actress involved had a passing resemblance to a certain presidential candidate. But he disowned that motivation, but also pointed to the fact that there's actually humor in Macbeth that nobody ever sees, because the expectation is that the play is so dark, there's no humor, and so they don't see some of these passages as comic relief. And he talked about how he had reshifted how they had presented the scenes in order to bring some of that comic relief back into the play, which I think was exactly right. And it's the same thing with Milton. Milton's got such a dreary, reputation that Miltonic humor, it would be viewed as sort of an oxymoron. But the truth is, he did, at least as a younger man, have a wry sense of humor. As a Cambridge undergraduate, he led some of the comic revels that they did as undergraduates at the time. So not only did he think he had a sense of humor, other people seemed to think that he had, his colleagues, his peers, thought he had a sense of humor as well. By the end of Elegy 6.0, it becomes clearer that Milton is not really being skeptical about Christianity, but simply the way that it is celebrated in both senses of the word. So let me, and I forgot to write the page number down, so bear with me for a second. But if you ask me what I'm doing, if at least you think it worthwhile knowing what I do, I celebrate the King of Peace from heaven's seed and happy eras promised in the scriptures, and God's first cries while stabled under the poor roof of he who graces heaven with his Father, and the star-spawning sky and singing throngs above, and gods abruptly shattered in their shrines. I gave these gifts to Christ, however, for his birthday, bestowed on me before the dawn's first light. So I think what we see here is it's much clearer at the time what Milton is against than what he is for. And it's a mistake, I think, to read a lot of his subsequent theological thinking into these poems and a lot of his early work, because he just simply was not there at the time. At least it's my view. Like Elegy 2, Elegy 3 is a lament for a senior official. But fortunately, this time we get a little bit of a glimpse of Milton's future greatness. We can't know for sure, but it appears that Milton's enthusiasm for the Bishop of Winchester, otherwise known as the theologian Launcelot Andrewes, who Eliot wrote a famous essay about, came not from a broad embrace of Andrewes' theology, but from Andrewes' popular writings against Guy Fawkes and the gunpowder plot. Just do a little digression here. The Book of Elegies ends with 2 sets of epigrams, as I mentioned, and one set of 5 epigrams focuses on the gunpowder plot. And we can summarize these epigrams probably best in the following way. Epigram 1, I despise Guy Fawkes. Epigram 2, I despise Guy Fawkes even more than you can tell from the previous epigram. Epigram 3, I despise Guy Fawkes even more than you can tell from the previous 2 epigrams, and then the next are fairly predictable. What's remarkable about Elegy 3 is not so much its characterization of Launcelot Andrewes or his views, but that most of this elegy is an elaborate dream sequence clearly inspired by Dante. A dream sequence so trippy, it is surprising that it did not develop a cult following in the psychedelic era. And let me give you just a brief taste. As I appeared to wander in a spacious field, alas, my talent can't describe my vision. There, everything was gleaming with a rosy glow, like mountain peaks that blush in sun at dawn. And as if Iris were revealing opulence, earth glittered in her multicolored garb. Slight Zephyr's love, the goddess Chloris, did not deck the Alcanoan gardens with such flora. The silver rivers wash Spring's fields. Sand shimmers more exquisitely than by Spain's Tagus River. The west wind's gentle. I can't read West. Having worked at the White House for a year and a half, I see there, and I want to say West Wing just as I did. So I apologize for that. The west wind's gentle breath, a dewy breath that springs from countless roses, slides through countless buildings. This home is thought to be like Lucifer the King's on distant shores within the the Ganges region. As I observed dense shadows near grape-laden vines and shining points in space in all directions, Winchester's bishop, look, abruptly stands by me. An astral brilliance shines from his bright face. Down to his golden ankles, spotless clothing flows. A glowing mitre crowns his holy head. As the honored old man strides forth in these clothes, verdant ground trembles with a joyous noise. The hosts of heaven are applauding with jeweled wings. Pure air resounds with a triumphant trumpet. Milton's love of things Italian, perhaps influenced by his affection for Diodati, tends to be underestimated by scholars who often forget that he wrote 5 accomplished sonnets and 1 canzone stanza in Italian. You'll also see that love of things Italian in the second set of epigrams, which are repetitively rapturous about the Italian singer Leonora Baroni. Scholars tend to duck and run after noting the influence of Dante on this elegy, and I think that's almost surely a mistake. Even by the second year of his university studies, Milton had read widely and voraciously. It is an interesting and unanswered question whether Milton had also read some of the mystical medieval dream poetry that inspired Dante, perhaps most notably Walafrid Strabo's Visio Wettini. I suspect that Paradise Lost has roots in this text or some other overlooked older Latin poetry. A postscript to Elegy 3 is that Milton tore Andrews apart in print in his 1641 tract, The Reason of Church Government. The vague apology Milton made in his Untitled Epigram may have been driven solely by a desire to distance himself from Andrews. Let me start to wrap up by turning to Elegy 4, which is an epistolary poem to one of his former tutors, a Scottish clergyman named Thomas Young, who was stationed in Germany. This elegy occupies a space somewhere between the Bloodless Elegy 2 and the 2 Diodati elegies. While it feels a bit like an exercise, there is a subtext here. Milton is showing a mentor that he is as competent in Christian references as he is with the classical references that are crowding these elegies. There are also moments of sentimentality. Again, very unexpected, I think, for a lot of people because it's Milton, which may diminish the work in some ways, but it also opens a rare window into how this poet actually thought and felt. For those who are insistent on viewing Milton as rigid, ideological, and rigidly ideological, it is important to keep in mind that Young and Milton remain close despite political differences over Milton's views on divorce and Young's acceptance of emoluments from the government. Despite these differences, in 1642, Milton, Young, and others co-authored a series of strident political tracts under an almost unpronounceable pseudonym. To wrap up, Milton's elegies had divided critics who often gave them a superficial reading. They've been described, as I mentioned, both as juvenilia and as the greatest works of Anglo-Latin literature. I don't think either characterization is fair. These are the works of what we would call today, and it's a term I hate, but we would call an emerging poet. And there are moments both for groaning and for admiring his genius. Most importantly, though, I think it's an important foundation for understanding one of our greatest and most complex poets. So thank you for being patient, and I'm happy to answer questions as long as none of those questions involve the forbidden words that start with C and W.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mike. This was great. And yeah, the floor is open for discussion. So let's see if anybody has any questions. We had one. Mike, I'm really fascinated. So you mentioned the influence of Italian literature on Milton. Do you think, is there any room for arguing that people like Dante and Petrarch may have kind of mediated his reception of the Latin classics, I'm thinking of Dante's, reworking of Ovid, for example, or, Petrarch's relationship, complicated relationship with Caesar and Virgil, and so on.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it depends a little bit on how you understand the question. Certainly, Milton's classical understanding at the age of 16, when he started at Cambridge, probably exceeded 98% of today's recent PhD graduates. The man had read an enormous amount of material, and not just read it. The annotations that you see on that he made on the first folio, which now I think is in the Athenaeum in Philadelphia, are incredibly intense. And he annotated almost all of his books in that way. So we know, when we say Milton read a book, it's a lot more than what I would normally do. It's really pretty intense. It's I only annotate books like that when I'm translating them. And so he certainly had an independent knowledge and opinion on pretty much everything in classical literature at that point. I think Petrarch and Dante were important for multiple reasons. I think they were the ones that opened him up to the possibility that you could be great in the vernacular language, that you didn't have to be great in Latin in order to be a great poet. And that was still up for grabs in Milton's time. Certainly in England, it was up for grabs. And you have to remember at that point, even Shakespeare, as great as he was, and Milton appreciated his greatness. And we know that not only from the first folio annotations, but Milton's first published poem was to Shakespeare and was probably published involuntarily. I mean, the lore about that is that the father, who obviously had the keen interest in the theater, probably knew Shakespeare, that the father published that poem without his son's permission. I think what Petrarch and Dante did more than anything else was to open up a whole vista of things that you could do with classical literature that people were not doing. I mean, what Dante did in the Divine Comedy, what Petrarch did in the Canzoniere, just it doesn't look like other medieval literature. There's a intensity about the sound and the music of the words and rhyme and meter and rhythm. There's sort of an opening of imagination as to what these characters might do and what you could say about them that I think in some ways when you're writing in Latin, you're weighted down by all the other people that have written in that tradition, and that it's very hard to break outside that tradition. And I think in a lot of ways, for Milton, it became easier to be more creative while writing in the vernacular rather than writing in Latin. I don't think that he, in theory, he could have written Paradise Lost in Latin. I mean, he was capable of doing it. It probably would have been a fine poem. But I think if he tried to do it, I think the burden of Virgil and others before him probably would have had a crushing effect on the imagination. So my answer to the question is yes, enthusiastic. I think that Dante and Petrarch were incredibly important for unleashing Milton's imagination.
And of course, since we haven't mentioned it yet, you're currently working on a translation of the Canzoniere yourself, aren't you?
Yes, I am. I recently signed my first contract with a big commercial publisher, W.W. Norton, and I'm spending 8 to 12 hours a day, 7 days a week on it, because when I thought about doing it, I realized I had to work incredibly hard at it, or I probably wouldn't finish it while I was still alive. It's something that sort of haunts me a little bit. When I was translating Horace's Satires, I didn't find what I think in many ways is the best translation in English until I was well into the project. And I didn't find it because it was an obscure press of a fairly well-known poet, William Matthews. And the reason it was in an obscure press and I didn't know about it is it wasn't finished. And I kind of made a little note of that. And I got to Book 2, Satire 3, which is about 1/4 of the length of all the satires. It just seems to go on forever. And I also found it very hard. And so my bride, who's sitting in the kitchen now listening to this, had the unexpected experience of hearing a few choice words coming out of the sunroom because I was struggling so much, with that satire. And it did hit me at some point. I made the connection that poor Matthews had actually died translating Book 2, Satire 3. So I'm going at this I've set aside my other 2 Latin projects, which are pretty close to done, or one Latin project and one substantial Latin. So I'm also translating, I'm doing got a nibble from a British University Press, a book for the poems by early women poets. It comes out of a class that I've taught annually at my daughter's high school alma mater. So we're looking at Proba and Sulpicia and Eukarya, who's fun and not very well known. So we're in that. I also have a collection, not just Latin, about 60% Latin maybe, of Phoenix poems, starting with Ovid and going through Shakespeare, and some famous authors and some not so famous. And that's been kind of wild and fun. But those are both on hold until I finish on Petrarch. I'm pretty close. This morning I was working on number 326 of the 366. And I did decide to go through it serially this time to make sure that I could actually crank them all out. So I've skipped some of the canzones, which are long and depressing, the same way that Book 2, Satire 3 is. But I'm getting close to the end. I'm hoping to be done with the first draft July, August. So yeah.
All right, that's great to hear, and we certainly all look forward to seeing that come out. Meanwhile, we have a question from Dan and Meredith Bergman. So Dan Bergman asks, what is your favorite poem from the book, and would you please read it for us?
Oh, it's too long to read, but my favorite is Book 1. It's just there's an endearing human element to Milton. You can see all those other things in his personality. You can tell that there's a sternness underneath. You can tell how totally marinated in the classical tradition he is and all those kind of things. But it's really fascinating to see warmth, to see tenderness, to see a little bit of humor. So I'll just do a little bit from the beginning, because I'll wear out the patience of everyone if I read it, because it's over 100 lines. I'll just read the beginning. Many of you will notice the trope in the beginning is a fairly familiar one in classical literature. Probably the most likely place where he cribbed this would have been Martial. At last your letters came to me, beloved friend. The paper brought your news and tones of voice. Brought them from western banks of Chester's River Dee, which heads out to the Irish Sea downriver. Trust me, I'm thrilled that far off lands sustained for me a loving heart and such a loyal mind. Some distant country owes me my good exiled friend, but will return him as prescribed from there. Washed by the Thameses tide, London transfixes me, and my dear nation holds me not by force. And then we go into the reed-soaked cam, and you know, I'm in exile and that kind of thing. So you see, there's just a humanity to Milton there. Not this. I mean, I'm as intimidated by the later Milton probably as anybody, but there's a real humanity there that, you know, I found very welcome.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. Do we have any other questions?
Mike, I'm just curious about, can you talk a little bit about your journey as a Latinist? Because you weren't a Latin teacher ever, or a professor of classics or anything like that, right?
I'm a total fraud. No, I'm what I prefer to total fraud is dangerous amateur. So I had 4 years of mandatory Latin and 1 year of optional Latin at Roxbury Latin School here in Boston, and didn't continue. I was not a classics major. I used Latin a little bit. You know, I was a double major in English and philosophy, so my senior thesis was on Chaucer and Boethius. And then I kind of let it go, and really I let poetry go for about a decade, and then I realized I'd made a mistake, and I also realized instead of writing bad imitations of the poets who were popular when I was a teenager, that I really wanted to write more like the poets that I was really enjoying there and didn't have to pretend to enjoy. And I discovered Philip Larkin and others, and I said, well, you know, can I teach myself to write in meter and rhyme? And so I started doing a lot of translation as an exercise. At some point, to judge how well you're doing, you line it up against other published translations, and I thought I was doing okay, and I started sending them out, and editors agreed. And at some point, about 10 years later, I decided to get a little bit more ambitious. I got I was a fellow at the Swanee Writers Conference, and Wyatt Prunty, the famous head of the conference, gave me a very well-meaning kick in the pants and said, you know, your stuff is really good, but you need to be more ambitious. You need to risk failure a little bit more. And that pushed me toward looking at book length, you know, translations. But my Latin was pretty good as a high school student. I had lost a lot of it, so getting it back was pretty tricky. And a couple of my friends who tried to help me, I think, were despairing that I would ever get there. But it came, and I think it also was very helpful for me. I think I got a lot better when I started writing the commentaries, because I just went down to a whole nother level of detail about things. And it's something I really couldn't have done much earlier, because, you know, you need the internet to do those things in order to access the resources and to look smarter than you are, and do actual, you know, make actual philological contributions. There's all these wonderful databases out there that I learned how to use, and yet a lot of classicists don't use. And so, you know, to identify echoes in Maximianus or Oldham, you know, there wasn't really much written about Maximianus. There was some on Oldham, but someone like Orchard, who's one of the top Oldham scholars, identified a lot of the echoes just from being a smart guy and having read a lot of stuff and seeing the similarities. But somebody less erudite, but more plodding and persistent, can sit there with the Monumenta database or some of the others, and just keep methodically checking words, seeing what comes up, chasing down the rabbit holes. And in the course of chasing down those, or that's really kind of my graduate education in the classics, was writing those commentaries. And I sort of had to do it because there wasn't one for Oldham. and there was almost no scholarship on about 3/4 of the riddles. And what there was very focused. A lot of it was on showing connections to the Old English riddles, which is kind of, interesting, but doesn't help explain, what a lot of the riddles are really about. Similarly with Maximianus, there really wasn't much out there in English. The last commentary, which was a little eccentric, was from 1900. He's much more popular on the continent, not popular in the UK, which has a general distaste for late antique literature, but very popular in Italy and Germany, and to a lesser extent in France and Spain. So going through all those and writing those in order to translate them, really, that's kind of my graduate education, but I don't have any of the standard credentials that classical translators have.